The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud, and young Cale Thornwick could barely see his sheep through the gray veil. He adjusted his leather satchel and whistled softly to his border collie, Ash, who immediately began herding the scattered flock toward the eastern pastures. At 17, Cale had been tending these hills for nearly a decade, ever since his father fell to the wasting sickness that plagued their village. The village of Millhaven sat in a depression between two great hills, surrounded by the elderwood forest that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The forest was ancient beyond memory, its trees older than the kingdoms that rose and fell in the distant lands. Most villagers feared the deep woods, crossing themselves when they heard the strange calls that echoed from within at night. But Cale had always felt drawn to the green depths, though he'd never ventured far from the established grazing lands. Today felt different somehow. The air carried an electric tension that made the hairs on his arms stand on end, and Ash kept looking toward the forest with his ears pricked forward, whining softly. The sheep seemed nervous too, clustering together instead of spreading out to graze as they normally did. Cale counted his flock carefully, 43 ewes, 12 rams, and 18 lambs born this past spring. All accounted for, but they were restless. He decided to move them to the high meadow where the grass was sweeter and they might settle down. The path wound upward through scattered oak trees and granite outcroppings, following an old game trail that had been worn smooth by countless hooves over the years. As they climbed higher, the mist began to clear, revealing a perfect summer morning. The sun painted everything in shades of gold and green, and for a moment Cale forgot his worries. This was why he loved being a shepherd: the solitude, the connection to the land, the simple rhythm of watching over his charges. In the village below, people were already beginning their daily struggles with failing crops and dwindling food stores. The harvests had been poor for 3 years running, and many families were talking of abandoning Millhaven to seek their fortunes in the cities. But here on the hillside, surrounded by his sheep and with Ash at his side, Cale felt a peace that the village could never provide. He pulled out a piece of brown bread and hard cheese from his satchel, sharing small bits with Ash while keeping one eye on the flock. The sheep had settled somewhat in the high meadow, though they still seemed on edge. It was then that he heard the sound, a low, mournful howling that seemed to come from deep within the elderwood. Ash's ears shot up and he growled softly, the fur along his spine bristling. The sheep immediately bunched together, the ewes calling to their lambs in distress. Cale had heard wolves before, but this was different. The sound was too large, too deep, and it carried an intelligence that made his skin crawl. The howling came again, closer this time, and was answered by another from a different direction. Then another. Soon the forest rang with a chorus of inhuman voices that seemed to shake the very air. Cale's hand went instinctively to the long knife at his belt, a poor weapon against whatever was making those sounds. "Easy, Ash," he whispered to his dog, though his own voice was tight with fear. "Stay with the sheep." The howling stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and wrong. Even the birds had gone quiet. Cale strained his ears, listening for any sound of movement in the underbrush, but heard nothing. Minutes passed like hours as he waited, every muscle tense and ready to run. Then he saw them. They emerged from the tree line like shadows given form, creatures that might have been wolves if wolves grew to the size of draft horses and had eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence. Their fur was black as midnight, and their movements had a flowing quality that seemed almost liquid. There were at least 6 of them that Cale could see, probably more hidden in the forest. The dire wolves, for that's what they had to be, the monsters from the old stories, spread out in a hunting formation that spoke of cunning far beyond any normal predator. They were preparing to attack the flock, and there was nothing Cale could do to stop them. His knife would be useless against creatures that size, and even if he could somehow fight them off, more would come. One of the wolves, larger than the others and with scars crisscrossing its muzzle, stepped forward and fixed its burning yellow eyes on Cale. He felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, pressing down on him with primal terror. The creature's lips pulled back to reveal teeth like ivory daggers, and it let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate in Cale's chest. The sheep were in full panic now, bleating in terror as they pressed against each other. Some of the ewes were trying to push their lambs toward the center of the flock, while the rams lowered their heads and stamped their hooves in futile defiance. Ash positioned himself between the wolves and the sheep, hackles raised and teeth bared, though he was trembling with fear. Cale knew he should run. Every instinct screamed at him to abandon the flock and flee for his life. but these sheep represented everything his family had left in the world. Without them, his mother and younger sister would starve. The village might mock him for being a simple shepherd boy, but he had responsibilities that went beyond his own survival. Instead of running, Kale stepped forward and spread his arms wide, making himself as large a target as possible. If the wolves wanted the sheep, they would have to go through him first. "Come on then," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Let's get this over with." The scarred wolf tilted its head, as if puzzled by this display of defiance from such a small creature. Its pack mates shifted restlessly, waiting for the signal to attack. The moment stretched between them, predator and prey locked in a deadly dance that could only end one way. Then the forest erupted. Trees bent and swayed without any wind, their leaves rustling with a sound like rushing water. The ground beneath Kale's feet began to vibrate, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. The dire wolves stopped their advance, ears flattened against their heads as they looked around in confusion and growing fear. A wind rose from nowhere, carrying with it the scent of deep forest loam, wild flowers, and something else, something ancient and powerful that made the hair on Kale's neck stand on end. The mist that had been clearing suddenly thickened again, but now it glowed with an inner light that had no earthly source. From within that glowing fog came a voice, speaking in a language that Kale didn't recognize but somehow understood. The words seemed to bypass his ears entirely, speaking directly to something deep in his mind. They carried authority older than kingdoms, power that predated human civilization, and a barely contained fury that made the dire wolves whimper and back away. The largest wolf let out a defiant snarl and took a step forward, but whatever emerged from the mist made it freeze in its tracks. Even Kale, who had been prepared to die defending his flock, felt his knees go weak at what he saw. She was tall, perhaps 7 feet in height, with skin the color of autumn leaves and hair like flowing water that seemed to shift between green and brown and gold as it moved. Her eyes were the deep green of forest depths, ancient and knowing, with flecks of amber that caught the strange light. She wore no clothing in the conventional sense, but rather seemed to be wrapped in living vines and flowers that shifted and changed as she moved. Moss and tiny ferns grew along her arms and shoulders, and when she stepped, small flowers bloomed beneath her feet. This was no mortal woman. This was something far older, something that belonged to the time when the world was young and magic flowed through everything like water through a riverbed. The very air around her shimmered with power, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of storm winds and avalanches. The dire wolves, creatures that feared nothing in the natural world, turned and fled without a backward glance. They disappeared into the forest with their tails between their legs, their howls fading into the distance as they ran. In moments they were gone as if they had never been there at all. The forest goddess, for she could be nothing else, turned her attention to Kale, and he felt the full weight of her regard like a physical force. Those ancient eyes studied him with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to his soul, cataloging every thought and memory he had ever possessed. He should have been terrified. Any sane person would have been gibbering in fear at the sight of such a being. Instead, he felt an odd sense of calm descend over him. "You did not run," she said, and her voice was like wind through leaves, carrying undertones of approval that made something warm bloom in Kale's chest. "I couldn't," he replied honestly. "The sheep depend on me. My family depends on them." She nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "Most of your kind would have fled at the first sight of the shadow wolves. They value their own lives above all else." "Most people aren't shepherds," Kale said. "We're used to protecting things smaller and weaker than ourselves." A smile touched the corners of her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Indeed. Tell me, young shepherd, what do you know of the troubles that plague this land?" Kale frowned, unsure what she meant. "The harvests have been poor, if that's what you're asking. The soil doesn't seem to hold water like it used to, and the crops wither even when we get rain. Some of the elders say it's a punishment for our sins, but I don't know what sins a bunch of farmers and shepherds could have committed to deserve this." "Your people are not being punished," she said, her voice carrying a sadness that seemed to echo from the depths of the forest. "They are simply caught in the wake of a much larger catastrophe. The balance that has maintained this land for countless ages is breaking down, and if something is not done soon, everything you know will be consumed by shadow." She gestured toward the deep forest, and for a moment Kale could see past the trees to something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, the forest was dying. The leaves were brown and brittle, the trunks twisted and blackened as if burned from within. A creeping darkness spread outward from some central point, killing everything it touched. As he watched, he could see the blight advancing, moving slowly but inexorably toward the living forest where they stood. "What is that?" he whispered. "The devourer stirs," she replied. "It has been sleeping for 1,000 years, bound by the old treaties and the strength of the forest's heart. But those bonds are weakening, and when they fail completely, it will wake to finish what it began long ago, the consumption of all life in this realm." Kale stared at the spreading darkness, trying to process what he was seeing. "But surely there's something that can be done, the king's armies or the wizards in the capital." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Your kings know nothing of the old powers, and their wizards are children playing with candles while the inferno approaches. The armies of men would be less than gnats before the devourer's hunger." "Then what hope is there?" Kale asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. The goddess studied him for a long moment, her ancient eyes weighing and measuring. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but carried the weight of prophecy. "There is an old magic, older than the kingdoms of men, that might yet turn the tide. But it requires a champion, someone who can bridge the gap between the world of mortals and the realm of the forest. Someone who understands sacrifice and has already proven themselves willing to die for others." Kale felt his mouth go dry. "You're talking about me." "I am." She stepped closer, and he could smell the deep forest scent that clung to her, earth and moss and wild growing things. "But I will not command you, young shepherd. This must be your choice, made freely and with full knowledge of what it will cost." "What would I have to do?" he asked, though part of him already knew he would say yes regardless of the answer. "Accept a bond with the forest itself," she said. "Allow the wild magic to flow through you, changing you into something more than human but less than divine. You would become the guardian of the balance, charged with protecting the natural order against all who would disturb it. The power you would gain would be great, but the responsibility greater still. And once the bond is made, it cannot be broken. You would be tied to this land until the end of your days." Kale looked out over his sheep, who had finally calmed down and were beginning to graze again as if nothing had happened. Ash sat panting beside him, tongue lolling out, completely unaware that the fate of the world was being decided just feet away. Down in the valley, he could see the smoke rising from the chimneys of Millhaven, where his mother and sister waited for him to return home. If he accepted this burden, his old life would be over. He would become something other than human, bound to powers and responsibilities he couldn't even imagine. But if he refused, everything he cared about would eventually be consumed by the spreading darkness. His family, his village, his sheep, all of it would be lost. "If I do this," he said slowly, "will it be enough? Will I really be able to stop this devourer?" The goddess was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was honest but not reassuring. "I do not know. The power I can grant you is ancient and strong, but the devourer has grown in strength during its long slumber. It may be that even with the forest's blessing, you will not be strong enough to stand against it alone." "But there's a chance." "There is a chance," she confirmed. "Perhaps the only chance this world has." Kale closed his eyes and thought of his father, who had worked himself to death trying to keep the family farm productive even as the soil grew more barren each year. He thought of his mother, growing thin and worn from worry and too little food. He thought of his sister, bright and curious and deserving of a future that wasn't shadowed by creeping darkness. When he opened his eyes again, he found the goddess watching him with something that might have been compassion in her ancient gaze. "I'll do it," he said simply. She nodded as if she had expected no other answer. "Then kneel, Kale Thornwick, last shepherd of Millhaven, and receive the blessing of the elderwood." He knelt in the soft grass of the meadow, Ash whimpering softly beside him as if sensing that everything was about to change. The goddess placed her hands on his head, and immediately Kale felt power flowing into him like water into a dry riverbed. It started as a warm tingling in his scalp and spread downward through his entire body, changing him on a level deeper than flesh and bone. He could feel his senses expanding, becoming more acute than any human had a right to experience. He could hear the heartbeat of every sheep in his flock, smell the individual scents of 100 different wildflowers, feel the slow pulse of sap rising in the trees around them. But more than that, he could sense the forest itself, a vast network of living consciousness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The trees were not just plants, but ancient entities with their own thoughts and memories. The streams carried messages from distant mountains. The very soil beneath his feet hummed with an awareness that welcomed him as a long-lost brother. He was connected to all of it now, part of a web of life that had existed since the world began. But with the connection came knowledge, and that knowledge brought pain. He could feel the blight spreading through the distant reaches of the forest, a creeping poison that left death and emptiness in its wake. He could sense the devourer at the heart of that darkness, a presence so vast and hungry that it made his soul recoil in horror. And underlying everything was the knowledge that he was now responsible for protecting all of this against a force that had already consumed entire worlds in ages past. When the transformation was complete, the goddess stepped back and studied her handiwork. Kale rose to his feet, marveling at how different everything felt. He was still recognizably himself, but he could sense the changes in his body, enhanced strength and speed, senses far beyond human norm, and a connection to the natural world that would let him call upon its power in ways he was only beginning to understand. "The bond is made," the goddess said, and her voice now carried a note of satisfaction. "You are no longer merely human, Cale Thornwick. You are the forest's guardian, the bridge between worlds. But power without knowledge is useless, and knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. Your education begins now." She gestured toward the forest, and a path appeared among the trees that definitely hadn't been there before. It was paved with moss and lined with flowering vines, winding deeper into the elderwood than any human had walked in living memory. "Come," she said. "There is much you must learn before you can face what is coming. Your sheep will be safe here. No creature of shadow will dare approach while my blessing protects this place." Cale looked back at his flock one last time, then at Ash, who was watching him with confused but trusting eyes. He whistled softly, and the dog immediately came to his side, ready to follow wherever his master led. "Good boy," Cale murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Whatever trials lay ahead, at least he wouldn't face them alone. Together, the former shepherd and his faithful companion followed the forest goddess into the deep woods, leaving behind the world of men to learn the ancient secrets that might yet save it from destruction. Behind them, the sheep grazed peacefully in the protected meadow, unaware that their young guardian had just accepted a burden that would reshape the very foundations of the world. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the last traces of mist and revealing a day that looked no different from any other. But appearances could be deceiving, and this was the day that everything changed. The day a simple shepherd boy stepped onto a path that would lead him to become either the salvation of his world or its final witness. The path through the elderwood was unlike anything Cale had ever experienced. The moss beneath his feet seemed to glow with its own inner light, and the flowering vines that lined the way responded to his presence by blooming more brightly. Every step took him deeper into a realm that felt increasingly removed from the ordinary world he had known. The forest goddess, who had introduced herself as Silviana during their walk, moved ahead of him with a grace that made it seem as though she was floating rather than walking. Her connection to this place was so complete that the trees themselves bent aside to let her pass, and small woodland creatures emerged from their hiding places just to catch a glimpse of her. "Tell me about the devourer," Cale said as they walked, Ash trotting alongside them with his tongue hanging out happily. Despite the dire circumstances, the dog seemed to be enjoying this adventure immensely. Silviana's expression darkened. "It is a being from the void between worlds, a creature of pure hunger that exists only to consume. Long ago, when the barriers between realms were thinner, it found its way into our world and began to feed. Everything it touched was drained of life, not just killed but completely consumed, reduced to nothing more than empty space." She paused beside a massive oak tree whose trunk was easily 20 feet across. When she placed her hand against its bark, Cale could see images flickering in the wood grain, ancient scenes of a vast shadow spreading across green lands, leaving only barren wasteland in its wake. The old alliance between humans, elves, dwarves, and the forest spirits managed to contain it, Silviana continued, but at terrible cost. Entire kingdoms were sacrificed to fuel the binding spells, and many of the ancient races were reduced to mere legends. The devourer was imprisoned in the heart of the Shadowlands, locked away by chains forged from the life force of countless willing souls. "But the chains are weakening," Cale observed, remembering what he had seen in her earlier vision. "Yes, the magic that binds it requires constant renewal, a price paid in life and light. For 1,000 years, the forest has provided that power, slowly sacrificing itself to maintain the prison. But we are reaching the limits of what can be given. Within a year, perhaps two, the bonds will fail completely. They resumed walking, and Kale noticed that the forest around them was growing stranger. The trees here were enormous, their canopies so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. Flowers bloomed in impossible colors, deep purples that seemed to absorb light, silvers that chimed softly in the breeze, and golds that left trails of sparkles in the air when the wind stirred them. "This place feels different," he said, looking around in wonder. "We approach the Heart Grove," Silviana explained. "The oldest part of the forest, where the first trees took root when the world was young. It is here that you will learn to master your new abilities, and here that we will prepare for what is to come." As if summoned by her words, the trees ahead of them began to thin, revealing a circular clearing perhaps 100 yards across. At its center stood a tree so massive that Kale initially mistook it for a hill. Its trunk rose impossibly high, disappearing into a canopy that seemed to blend with the sky itself. The bark was silver-white, smooth as polished marble, and covered with spiraling patterns that seemed to move and shift when he looked at them directly. But it was the tree's roots that truly took his breath away. They emerged from the ground in graceful arcs, some as thick as castle walls, creating a natural amphitheater around the base of the trunk. Smaller trees grew from these roots, not separate plants, but extensions of the great tree itself, forming a connected grove that pulsed with shared life. "The World Tree," Silviana said softly. "The mother of all forests, the first and greatest of her kind. She has stood here since the dawn of time, watching over the balance between order and chaos." As they approached the tree, Kale began to see that they were not alone in the clearing. Figures moved among the roots, some barely visible as shifting patterns of light and shadow, others more solid but clearly not human. He caught glimpses of tall, graceful forms with pointed ears and clothing that seemed to be woven from moonbeams. Shorter, stockier figures worked among what appeared to be gardens carved directly into the living wood, their bearded faces creased with concentration. "Elves and dwarves?" he asked in amazement. "I thought they were just stories." "Your people forget quickly," Silviana replied with a sad smile. "When the Great War against the Devourer ended, the surviving members of the elder races withdrew from the world of men. They have been here all along, maintaining the ancient knowledge and keeping watch for signs that the enemy might return." An elf approached them as they neared the tree, a tall woman with silver hair that fell to her waist and eyes the color of starlight. She moved with the same fluid grace as Silviana, but where the goddess radiated wild, untamed power, the elf seemed refined, controlled, like a perfectly balanced sword. "Lady Silviana," the elf said, inclining her head respectfully. "We felt the awakening. Is this the one you have chosen?" "He is," Silviana replied. "Kale Thornwick, meet Eliana Moonwhisper, keeper of the ancient lore and teacher of the old ways." Eliana studied Kale with those unsettling, star-bright eyes, and he felt as though she was reading his soul like an open book. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. "I sense the forest's mark upon him," she said. "The bond is strong, perhaps stronger than any we have seen in centuries, but strength alone will not be enough for what is coming. He will need wisdom, discipline, and knowledge of powers that have not been used in 1,000 years." "Which is why he is here," Silviana said. "How long do we have?" Eliana's expression grew troubled. "The binding weakens daily. Master Ironforge believes we have perhaps 18 months before complete failure, but that assumes the Devourer remains dormant, if it begins to actively test its prison." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Kale could see the implications clearly enough. A new voice spoke from behind them, deep and gravelly with the accent of hammered metal. "Aye, and there's been stirrings in the deep places, shadows where there should be light, cold where there should be warmth. The beast knows its time approaches." Kale turned to see a dwarf approaching, his beard shot through with silver and his hands stained with what looked like metal-working soot. Despite his relatively small stature, he radiated an aura of solid reliability that reminded Kale of the mountain stones themselves. "Thoric Ironforge," the dwarf said, extending a calloused hand. "Master of the forge and keeper of the ancient weapons, and you're the lad who's meant to save us all, eh?" Kale shook the offered hand, surprised by the strength in the dwarf's grip. "I hope so, though I'm beginning to understand just how little I know about what that actually means." Thoric barked out a laugh. Aye, that's the first sign of wisdom right there. Most heroes start out thinking they know everything. Those ones usually end up dead before they can do much good. Come, Sylviana said, gesturing toward the massive tree. There is something you must see before we begin your training. She led them to where the roots formed a natural stairway up to a hollow in the trunk. The opening was perfectly circular, about 8 feet across, and seemed to lead into the heart of the tree itself. As they approached, Cale could see that the interior was not dark as he had expected, but filled with a soft, golden light. Place your hand upon the bark, Sylviana instructed. The world tree wishes to know you. Cale hesitated for just a moment, then pressed his palm against the smooth silver surface. Immediately, he was overwhelmed by a rush of sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was as if the accumulated memories and wisdom of countless ages flooded through him all at once. The slow growth of forests, the changing of seasons over millennia, the rise and fall of civilizations, the eternal struggle between life and entropy. But more than that, he could feel the tree's consciousness, vast, patient, and incredibly ancient. It examined him with the same thoroughness that Eliana had shown, but this inspection went far deeper, touching parts of his mind and soul that he hadn't even known existed. For a moment, he felt like an ant being studied by a mountain, and the sheer scope of the tree's awareness threatened to crush his individual identity entirely. Then, just as he thought he might be lost forever in that ocean of ancient thought, something changed. The tree's attention focused on something it found within him, not his newfound connection to the forest, but something deeper and more fundamental. His capacity for sacrifice, perhaps, or his willingness to protect those weaker than himself. Whatever it was, the tree seemed to approve. Images began to flow through the connection, not random memories this time, but specific information that the tree wanted him to see. He saw the original war against the Devourer, watched armies of humans, elves, and dwarves standing together against a tide of absolute darkness. He saw the great sacrifice that had created the binding, witnessed the moment when thousands of heroes willingly gave their lives to forge chains of pure spirit around the enemy. But he also saw what had happened afterward. The world had been left wounded by the conflict, its magical balance permanently altered. The elder races, decimated by the war, had withdrawn from human contact to focus on maintaining the prison. Humanity, cut off from its former allies and with its own magical traditions largely destroyed, had gradually forgotten that the supernatural world existed at all. "You see now why your people cannot help us," Eliana said softly as the visions faded. "They have been living in a diminished world for so long that they no longer remember what was lost." Cale removed his hand from the tree, feeling strangely empty after the richness of the connection. But some humans must remember. The old stories, the legends, surely someone believes. "A few," Thorek admitted grudgingly. "Hedge wizards and wise women who cling to fragments of the old knowledge, but they are scattered and weak, and most of their lore has been corrupted by centuries of retelling. They could not stand against the Devourer any more than ordinary soldiers could." "Which brings us back to you," Sylviana said. "The bridge between worlds, the one who can unite what has been divided. But first, you must learn to master the power that now flows through your veins." Over the following days, Cale's education began in earnest. Eliana taught him to sense the flow of natural magic through the world around him, showing him how to draw upon that power without depleting the source. It was like learning to breathe underwater, completely alien at first, but gradually becoming more natural with practice. The elven lorekeeper had a teaching style that was both patient and demanding. She would demonstrate a technique once, then expect Cale to master it through repetition and careful observation. When he struggled with a particularly difficult exercise, attempting to encourage the growth of a dying sapling, she simply sat in silence until he figured out the correct approach on his own. "Magic is not about imposing your will upon the world," she explained during one lesson. "It is about finding the harmony that already exists and adding your voice to the chorus. Force creates resistance, but harmony creates strength." Meanwhile, Thorek introduced him to the more practical aspects of his new role. The dwarf had spent the last 1,000 years crafting weapons and tools specifically designed to combat creatures of shadow and void. His workshop, built into the roots of the world tree itself, was filled with marvels that would have been dismissed as fairy tales in Millhaven. "This here's Shadowbane," Thorek said, hefting a sword that seemed to drink in the light around it. "Forged from meteoric iron and quenched in the tears of a phoenix. One cut from this blade will banish any shadow creature back to the void where it belongs. The weapon was beautiful in a deadly way, its blade inscribed with runes that seemed to move and shift as Kale watched. When Thorek placed it in his hands, he felt a surge of power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "The weight's perfect," he said in amazement. Despite being longer than any sword he had ever seen, it felt as light as a walking stick. It's been waiting for you," Thorek replied with satisfaction. "I started forging it 900 years ago, when the first prophecies spoke of a guardian who would arise when the binding began to fail. Took me that long to get it right." But perhaps the most important part of his education came from Sylviana herself. In the evenings, when the formal lessons were done, she would walk with him through the Heart Grove and speak of the deeper mysteries, the connections between all living things, the cycles of death and rebirth that maintained the balance, and the responsibilities that came with power. "You are no longer bound by human limitations," she told him one night as they sat beside a stream that glowed with its own inner light. "But neither are you free from human concerns. The guardian must be the protector of both worlds, the mystical and the mundane. You cannot save one by sacrificing the other." "Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough," Kale admitted. "Everything I've learned so far just makes the Devourer seem more impossible to defeat. How can one person, even with all this power, stand against something that conquered armies?" Sylviana was quiet for a long moment, watching the glowing fish that swam in the stream. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Strength is not about the size of your sword or the power of your magic," she said. "True strength comes from understanding what is worth fighting for and refusing to abandon it no matter the cost. The heroes who originally bound the Devourer were not the strongest warriors or the most powerful wizards of their age. They were the ones who loved their world enough to die for it." "And if love isn't enough," Kale asked. "Then we will fall," she replied simply. "But we will fall fighting, and perhaps that defiance will inspire others to continue the struggle. Sometimes that is all we can do, bear witness to the light even as the darkness closes in." As the weeks passed, Kale's abilities grew by leaps and bounds. He learned to commune with the trees, drawing upon their strength and wisdom. He mastered the art of traveling through the forest at supernatural speed, moving from tree to tree like wind through leaves. Most importantly, he developed the ability to sense disturbances in the natural order, a skill that would prove vital in the battles to come. But with his growing power came an increasing awareness of the enemy they faced. During his meditation sessions, he sometimes felt the Devourer's presence pressing against the edges of his consciousness, a vast, hungry emptiness that made him physically ill. It was like staring into an abyss that stared back with malevolent intelligence. "It knows about you now," Eliana observed after one particularly disturbing encounter. "Your awakening has not gone unnoticed. The Devourer can sense the forest's champion, and it will be preparing countermeasures." "What kind of countermeasures?" Kale asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Corruption," Thorek replied grimly. "The beast can't reach beyond its prison directly, but its influence can seep through the cracks. It will try to turn the forest's own power against itself, creating servants from the very life force we depend upon." As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted from the outer reaches of the grove. Shouts echoed between the trees, followed by a sound that made Kale's blood run cold, the anguished scream of something that had once been alive but was now something else entirely. "Shadow touched," Eliana said, her face pale with horror. "It has already begun." They ran toward the sound, Kale drawing Shadowbane as they moved. Behind them, the World Tree's light seemed to flicker, as if the ancient giant was afraid of what was coming. And in the distance, just at the edge of perception, Kale could feel something vast and hungry stirring in its prison, testing the weakening chains that held it bound. The real war was about to begin. The creature that emerged from the shadowed underbrush was a nightmare fusion of plant and darkness. What had once been a majestic elk now stood twisted and wrong, its antlers blackened and dripping with a substance that hissed when it hit the ground. Its eyes glowed with the same malevolent intelligence Kale had seen in the dire wolves, but worse. This was corruption from within, the forest's own children turned against their mother. Vines and thorns grew from its flesh in unnatural patterns, weaving together into an armor of living darkness. Where its hooves touched the ground, the grass withered and died, leaving behind patches of bare earth that looked burned from within. The creature let out another of those anguished screams, a sound that spoke of terrible pain mixed with alien hunger. "Stay back," Eliana commanded, but Kale was already moving forward with Shadowbane raised. The sword's blade gleamed with inner fire, and he could feel it pulling him toward the corrupted creature like a lodestone draws iron. The Shadow Elk saw him coming and lowered its twisted antlers, charging with a speed that would have been impressive even before its transformation. But Kale's training had prepared him for this moment. He stepped aside at the last second, letting the creature's momentum carry it past him, then brought his sword down in a clean arc that severed one of the blackened antler points. The creature screamed again, but this time the sound was different, less anguish, more rage. It spun with impossible agility and lashed out with hooves that had been transformed into razor-sharp weapons. Kale barely managed to get his sword up in time to block, the impact sending shockwaves up his arms despite his enhanced strength. "The corruption is deep," Thorek called out from behind him. "You'll need to cut to the heart of it to break the Devourer's hold." Easier said than done. The Shadow Elk was faster and stronger than any natural creature had a right to be, and it fought with a vicious intelligence that suggested the Devourer's influence was more than just mindless hunger. Every attack was precisely calculated to exploit any opening in Kale's defense, and the corrupted vines that covered its body could strike independently, like serpents seeking vulnerable flesh. Kale found himself driven backward, forced to give ground as the creature pressed its assault. His sword work was improving with each exchange. The weapon seemed to guide his movements, showing him where to strike for maximum effect. But the Shadow Elk adapted to his tactics almost as quickly as he developed them. Then Ash joined the fight. The border collie had been hanging back, whimpering in confusion at the sight of the corrupted forest creature. But when he saw his master in danger, centuries of breeding for courage and loyalty overrode his fear. He darted in from the side, snapping at the creature's legs with remarkable bravery for such a small animal. The distraction was exactly what Kale needed. As the Shadow Elk turned to deal with this new threat, he stepped forward and drove Shadowbane deep into its flank. The sword's blade passed through the corrupted flesh like it was made of smoke, and where it touched, the darkness began to burn away like fog before the morning sun. The creature staggered, the alien intelligence in its eyes flickering as the Devourer's hold began to weaken. For a moment, Kale saw something else there, the confused, frightened consciousness of the original elk, trapped within its own corrupted body and aware of everything that had been done to it. "I'm sorry," he whispered and drove the blade deeper. The Shadow Elk collapsed, the corruption dissolving into wisps of black smoke that were quickly dispersed by the natural magic of the Heart Grove. What remained was the body of an ordinary elk, peaceful in death, finally free from the nightmare that had claimed it. "Well done," Eliana said, though her voice was tight with concern rather than celebration. "But this was only a scout, if the Devourer can reach this far into the protected lands." She didn't need to finish the thought. Kale could feel it too, a wrongness in the air that suggested more corrupted creatures were moving through the forest, drawn by some instinct to attack the Heart Grove. The prison was weakening faster than anyone had anticipated. Over the following days, the attacks became more frequent and more organized. Shadow touched wolves, corrupted bears, even twisted tree spirits that had been turned against their own kind. Each battle taught Kale something new about using his abilities, but they also showed him just how vast the enemy's resources were becoming. "We cannot continue fighting defensively," Sylviana declared during a council meeting held in the hollow of the World Tree. "Each creature we destroy is replaced by two more, and the corruption spreads with every attack. We must take the fight to the source." "The Shadowlands," Thorek said grimly. I've been thinking the same thing, but it's a journey none have attempted in 800 years. The approaches are guarded by worse things than Shadow Elk, and the corruption grows stronger the closer you get to the prison." "Which is exactly why we need to act now," Eliana added. "Before the binding fails completely and releases the Devourer's full power. Once that happens, no force in this world will be able to stand against it." Kale studied the crude map they had spread across the great tree's root system. The Shadowlands were marked as a dark blot at the forest's heart, surrounded by regions labeled with ominous names: the Screaming Hills, the Valley of Bones, the Withered Wood. Even the approaches looked treacherous enough to kill an ordinary person. "How far?" he asked. 3 weeks hard travel through increasingly hostile territory," Eliana replied. Assuming we can even find a path through the corruption barriers. And assuming we survive the journey, Thorek added cheerfully. The closer we get to the prison, the stronger the Devourer's influence becomes. By the time we reach the Shadowlands proper, reality itself starts to break down. You make it sound impossible, Kale observed. It is impossible, Sylviana said bluntly. Which is why it might actually work. The Devourer expects us to behave rationally, to wait and gather our strength before making our move. It will not be prepared for an immediate assault on its prison. What would we be trying to accomplish? Kale asked. Even with all my new abilities, I can't imagine I'm strong enough to reinforce thousand-year-old binding spells. Not reinforce, Eliana corrected. Replace. The original binding was created through willing sacrifice, thousands of souls freely given to forge chains of pure spirit. But there is another way. A single individual with enough power and the right connection to the forest could theoretically create a new prison. Theoretically, Kale repeated. The ancient texts speak of it, she continued. A guardian's ultimate sacrifice, to become one with the binding itself, using his own life force to create an eternal prison. But the cost. Death, Thorek said flatly. Not just death, but complete dissolution. No afterlife, no rest, just an eternity spent holding back the darkness. Kale felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He had accepted that this path might lead to his death, but this was something far worse. An existence stretched out across centuries of constant struggle, alone in the dark with only the enemy for company. There has to be another way, he said. Perhaps, Sylviana admitted. But we will not know until we reach the prison and can examine the binding for ourselves. The texts are fragmentary at best, and much knowledge was lost during the chaos after the war. Then we go, Kale decided. When do we leave? We, Thorek raised an eyebrow. Lad, this isn't a journey for an army. The corruption affects large groups more easily than individuals, and the path through the Shadowlands will only support a few travelers at most. I'm not sending him alone, Sylviana said firmly. The Guardian may have the power to stand against the Devourer's influence, but he lacks the experience to navigate the deeper mysteries. I will accompany him. And me, Eliana added. Someone needs to interpret the ancient bindings when we find them. Thorek grumbled something about foolhardy elves and their death wishes, but eventually agreed to come as well. Someone needs to watch over you idiots, he said. Besides, if we're going to attempt something this insane, we'll need proper equipment. They spent the next 3 days in intensive preparation. Thorek worked around the clock in his forge, crafting specialized gear for the journey. In addition to Shadowbane, he created armor that could resist corruption, amulets that would provide some protection against the Devourer's mental influence, and supplies that wouldn't spoil in the presence of pure entropy. Eliana gathered maps and lore from the deepest archives, piecing together root fragments from various expeditions that had attempted to reach the Shadowlands over the centuries. Most had never returned, but a few survivors had left cryptic notes about the dangers they had encountered. The corruption creates illusions, she explained as they studied one particularly disturbing account. Hallucinations designed to lead travelers astray or drive them mad. This expedition reported seeing their own deaths played out in endless variation, each vision more horrible than the last. Cheerful, Kale muttered, then looked up from the map. What about Ash? I can't leave him behind, but this journey sounds dangerous enough for beings with supernatural protection. The dog comes, Sylviana said firmly. His loyalty to you provides a form of protection that no magic can duplicate. In the darkest places, when illusion and madness threaten to overwhelm everything else, the love of a faithful companion can serve as an anchor to reality. On the morning of their departure, Kale stood at the edge of the Heart Grove and looked back at the World Tree one final time. The ancient giant seemed somehow diminished, its silver bark less lustrous than when he had first seen it. The Devourer's growing influence was affecting even this most protected of places. The other inhabitants of the grove had gathered to see them off. Elves and dwarves, tree spirits and flower fairies, all the hidden folk who had maintained the balance for so long. Their faces were solemn, and many were openly weeping. They knew as well as anyone that this might be the last desperate gambit of a dying world. A young elf maiden stepped forward and pressed something into Kale's hand. A small wooden charm carved in the shape of a leaf, warm to the touch and thrumming with gentle power. "From all of us," she said softly, "so you remember what you're fighting to preserve." Similar gifts followed: a stone from the deepest mountain roots, a vial of water from the first spring, a feather from a phoenix that had died defending the grove centuries ago. Each token carried with it the hopes and blessings of an entire people, and Kale felt their weight both physically and spiritually. "Time to go," Thorex said gruffly, hefting a pack that clanked ominously with whatever gear he had deemed essential for their journey. "The longer we delay, the stronger the corruption grows." They set off through the forest following paths that few living beings had ever seen. Silviana led the way, her connection to the wood allowing her to find routes that avoided the worst of the spreading taint. Behind her walked Eliana, consulting ancient maps and making notes about the changes wrought by centuries of growing darkness. Thorek brought up the rear, grumbling constantly, but keeping his weapons ready for any sign of trouble. Kale walked in the middle of their small group, one hand resting on Shadowbane's hilt and the other occasionally reaching down to scratch behind Ash's ears. The dog seemed to sense the importance of their mission, staying close to his master's side instead of ranging ahead to investigate interesting scents as he normally would. For the first 2 days, their journey proceeded without major incident. They encountered a few shadow-touched creatures, but these were easily dispatched with Kale's growing skill and his companion's ancient knowledge. The forest itself seemed to be helping them, opening paths where none had existed before and providing shelter during their rest periods. But as they moved deeper into the affected regions, the signs of corruption became impossible to ignore. Trees stood leafless and blackened, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Streams ran with water that looked normal but tasted of ash and despair. The very air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if the presence of the devourer was slowly leaching the life from everything around its prison. On the third night, as they made camp in a grove of silver birches that had somehow remained untouched by the spreading blight, Eliana made a disturbing discovery. "The corruption is moving faster than our maps indicate," she said, comparing her ancient charts to the desolation they had witnessed that day. "At this rate, it will reach the outer settlements within months rather than years." "Which means we're running out of time even faster than we thought," Kale observed. "Worse than that," Silviana added, her voice tight with concern. "If the corruption is accelerating, it suggests the devourer is actively working to weaken its bonds. It may be aware of our mission." As if summoned by her words, a sound echoed through the night, a howling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But this wasn't the cry of any shadow-touched creature they had encountered before. This was something far older and more terrible, a voice that spoke of hunger beyond comprehension and malice beyond measure. The devourer knew they were coming. Around their small campfire, the 4 companions and 1 loyal dog settled in for what might be their last peaceful night. Tomorrow they would enter the Screaming Hills, where reality itself began to fray at the edges. And beyond that lay the Shadowlands proper, where their greatest enemy waited in chains that grew weaker with every passing hour. Kale stared into the fire and thought about the simple shepherd he had been just a few short weeks ago. That person seemed like a stranger now, someone who had lived in a smaller, safer world where the greatest dangers were wolves and harsh weather. He missed that simplicity sometimes, but he wouldn't trade it back. The knowledge of what was at stake, the power to actually make a difference, these were gifts beyond price, even if the cost might ultimately be everything he had ever hoped to be. "No matter what happens," he said quietly, "I want you all to know that this has been an honor. I never imagined I would have the chance to fight alongside legends." "The honor is ours, young guardian," Eliana replied. "It has been long since the elder races stood together in common cause." "Aye," Thorek agreed, raising a flask of something that smelled like liquid fire. "To the last alliance, and to whatever fate awaits us in the darkness ahead." They drank. Even Ash got a small sip, though he immediately sneezed and shook his head in dismay, and settled down to rest. But sleep was difficult to find, and when it finally came, it brought dreams of shadows and chains, of ancient battles and terrible sacrifices yet to come. In the distance, the devourer's howl continued to echo through the night, a sound that promised that their greatest trials still lay ahead. The Screaming Hills lived up to their name. As their small band crested the first ridge, the sound hit them like a physical blow, a continuous wailing that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath their feet. It wasn't quite human, but it carried enough similarity to mortal anguish that every instinct screamed at them to flee. Even Ash pressed himself against Kale's legs, whimpering softly. "The voices of the first binding," Eliana explained, her own voice strained as she fought against the psychic assault. "When the original prison was forged, thousands of volunteers gave their lives to create the chains. Their sacrifice was so complete that their very souls became part of the binding, and their last moments echo here still." Kale pulled his cloak tighter around himself, though it provided no protection against the supernatural cold that seemed to seep into his bones. The landscape ahead was a nightmare of jagged stone and twisted metal, or what looked like metal but might have been something else entirely. Spires of black crystal jutted from the ground at impossible angles, and the sky overhead had taken on a sickly green hue that hurt to look at directly. "How far to the other side?" Thorek asked, though he had to shout to be heard over the eternal screaming. "2 days if we push hard," Sylviana replied. "But we must be careful not to stray from the path. The hills are littered with the bones of those who lost their way." They began their descent into the nightmare landscape, following a trail that seemed to shift and change when they weren't looking directly at it. The screaming grew louder as they went deeper, accompanied now by whispers in languages that predated human speech. The whispers spoke of despair and defeat, of struggles that had already been lost before they began. "Don't listen to the voices," Eliana warned. "They're not entirely the echoes of the ancient dead anymore. The Devourer has corrupted even their sacrifice, twisting their final moments into tools of torment." But ignoring the voices was easier said than done. As they picked their way between the crystal formations, Kale began to hear words he could almost understand, fragments of prophecy, warnings about the future, accusations that cut straight to his deepest fears. "You will fail as all the others have failed," one voice whispered with the sound of autumn leaves. "You are only human, and humans always break in the end." "Your friends will die because of your pride," another added, this one carrying the chill of winter frost. "Their blood will be on your hands when the darkness claims them." "The forest chose wrong," a third voice laughed with bitter amusement. "A shepherd boy against the hunger that devoured worlds, you might as well send a candle to fight the storm." Kale gritted his teeth and kept walking, but the whispers followed him, growing more personal and more vicious with each step. They spoke of his father's death, suggesting he could have saved him if he had been stronger. They painted pictures of his mother and sister starving while he played hero in the deep woods. They showed him visions of the Heart Grove burning, the world tree falling, all because he had been too weak to fulfill his destiny. By the time they made camp on the first night, the constant assault had worn all of them down to raw nerves. They ate their simple meal in silence, huddled around a fire that Thorek had coaxed from stones that seemed reluctant to burn. Even Sylviana looked haggard, her connection to the natural world offering no comfort in this place where nature itself had been corrupted. "It will get worse tomorrow," Eliana warned as she consulted her maps by flickering firelight. "We'll be passing through the heart of the hills where the original binding was strongest. The voices of 10,000 heroes cry out from that place, and not all of them remember which side they fought for." "Cheerful as always, Elf," Thorek muttered, but he was already preparing additional protections, amulets and charms that might offer some defense against the psychic storms ahead. Kale found himself staring into the fire, watching the flames dance in patterns that seemed almost like faces. Were they the ghosts of the ancient heroes, trying to communicate something important? Or were they just another manifestation of the corruption, designed to drive him mad with false hope? "I can feel it," he said suddenly, the words coming out before he had consciously decided to speak. "The Devourer, it's watching us, waiting to see if we'll break." "Of course it is," Sylviana replied matter-of-factly. "We are walking directly into the heart of its power, but remember, it watches because it fears. If victory was certain, it would not need to torment us with whispers and phantoms." "Does it?" Kale asked. "Fear, I mean, can something like that actually experience emotions as we understand them?" "Perhaps not emotions as mortals know them," Eliana mused. "But it can certainly experience want and hunger and the frustration of being denied what it desires. In its own way, the Devourer may be the most emotional being in existence, driven entirely by need and rage at anything that stands in the way of fulfilling that need." "A petulant child with the power to unmake worlds," Thorek observed. "Lovely." They slept poorly that night, disturbed by dreams that seemed to come from outside their own minds. Kale found himself reliving moments from his childhood, but twisted into horrible parodies where every joy became a source of pain, and every triumph was revealed as a failure in disguise. He woke several times to find Ash pressed against him, the dog's warm presence serving as an anchor to reality in the storm of manufactured anguish. The second day was worse, as Aliana had predicted. The screaming reached levels that would have been physically damaging if not for Thorek's protective charms, and the landscape itself became actively hostile. Paths would suddenly end at sheer cliff faces, forcing them to backtrack and find alternate routes. Stone formations would shift when they weren't being observed, creating mazes where none had existed moments before. Worse still, they began to see the bones that Sylviana had mentioned. Skeletons in ancient armor lay scattered among the crystals, some still clutching weapons that had long since corroded to rust. Many of the remains showed signs of violence, not from battle with external enemies, but from conflicts among the expedition members themselves. The corruption had turned allies against each other, feeding on their fears and paranoia until they destroyed themselves. "Stay close together," Aliana commanded as they navigated particularly treacherous passage between towering spires of black glass. "Whatever happens, do not let the voices convince you that your companions have been corrupted. That is the Devourer's favorite trick, to turn friends into enemies through suspicion and doubt." But even knowing the danger didn't make it easier to resist. As the day wore on, Kale found himself casting suspicious glances at his companions, wondering if the strain was beginning to show in ways that might indicate possession or influence. When Thorek stumbled over a loose stone, was it simple clumsiness or a sign that something else was controlling his movements? When Aliana paused to consult her maps, was she genuinely checking their route or secretly leading them astray? The worst moment came when they reached the heart of the hills, where the screaming was so intense that conversation became impossible. Here, the ancient binding had been at its strongest, and the echoes of that terrible sacrifice could drive even protected minds to madness. They had to rope themselves together like mountain climbers, trusting entirely in their shared determination to keep moving forward when individual will failed. It was in this place of ultimate corruption that the Devourer made its most direct assault yet. The screaming suddenly stopped, replaced by a silence so complete that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on them. Then, in that horrible quiet, a voice spoke. Not the whispers they had been hearing, but something vast and terrible that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You interest me, little shepherd," the Devourer said, and its words carried the weight of collapsing stars. "So young, so determined, so utterly doomed, do you truly believe you can succeed where armies have failed?" Kale forced himself to keep walking, though every step felt like moving through thick mud. Behind him, he could hear his companions struggling as well, their breathing labored as they fought against the entity's crushing presence. "I have to try," he said, amazed that his voice remained steady. The Devourer laughed, a sound like reality tearing apart at the seams. How refreshingly honest. Most heroes would have proclaimed their certainty of victory or babbled about hope and righteousness. But you, little shepherd, you know you are going to die. "Maybe," Kale admitted, "but that doesn't change anything." "It changes everything," the voice replied, suddenly sharper, hungrier. "Fear is honest, despair is truthful. Let me show you honesty, young guardian. Let me show you what awaits your world when you fail." The landscape around them suddenly shifted, and Kale found himself standing on a hilltop overlooking Millhaven. But this was not the village he remembered. The buildings were burned-out husks, their roofs collapsed and their windows dark. Bodies lay scattered in the streets, men, women, and children he had known since boyhood, all twisted into unnatural shapes by some terrible force. He saw his mother's house, or what remained of it. The walls had been torn away, leaving the interior exposed like a doll house. There, in what had once been the kitchen where she had prepared countless meals for her family, lay a figure that might have been her if figures could still be called human when they had been drained of everything that made them alive. "This is your future," the Devourer whispered. "This is what your heroism will accomplish. Everyone you have ever loved, everyone you have ever tried to protect, all of them will feed my hunger while you watch helplessly from whatever prison your own death creates." The vision was so vivid, so detailed, that for a moment Kale believed it completely. This wasn't just illusion. This was prophecy, a glimpse of the fate that awaited his world when his inevitable failure came to pass. What was the point of struggling against such overwhelming power? Why prolong the agony when the ending was already written? Then he felt something warm against his leg. Ash, pressing close to his master despite the horror surrounding them. The simple, unquestioning love in that contact cut through the despair like sunlight through storm clouds. Whatever the future held, he wasn't facing it alone. And as long as there were still those who loved and trusted him, he had no right to give up. "Maybe you're right," Kale said, reaching down to scratch behind Ash's ears. "Maybe I will fail, and maybe everyone I care about will die. But until that moment comes, I'm going to keep fighting. Not because I think I can win, but because that's what love requires." The vision shattered like broken glass, leaving them standing once again among the crystal spires of the screaming hills. The Devourer's presence receded, though its voice echoed with what might have been frustration. "Love," it spat with obvious disgust. "The great delusion that keeps mortals from accepting the truth of their meaningless existence. Very well, little shepherd, cling to your pretty lies. I will enjoy showing you how fragile they really are." The silence that followed was almost peaceful by comparison to what they had been enduring. Kale looked around at his companions and saw his own shaken but determined expression reflected in their faces. They had all witnessed the vision, all felt the weight of the Devourer's certainty, but they were still here, still moving forward. "Well," Thorak said after a moment, his voice only slightly hoarse from the ordeal, "I've had conversations with more charming entities, but I'll admit that one was educational." "It showed us its fears," Eliana observed, consulting her maps with hands that only trembled slightly. "For all its power, it felt the need to convince us to give up rather than simply crushing us. That suggests our mission has a better chance of success than it wants us to believe." "Or it's just enjoying the game," Sylviana added grimly. "Entities like the Devourer exist for so long that simple destruction becomes boring. Perhaps it prefers to savor our despair before consuming us." "Cheerful thought," Kale muttered, but he was already moving again, following the path that led deeper into the hills. Behind them, the screaming resumed, but it seemed somehow less overwhelming now. They had faced the enemy's direct attention and survived. Whatever lay ahead, they would meet it together. By evening of the second day, they finally emerged from the screaming hills onto relatively normal ground. The relief was so intense that Kale actually stumbled, his legs suddenly weak as the constant psychic pressure lifted. Even the air seemed cleaner here, though they were still deep in corrupted territory. "The withered wood," Eliana announced, pointing toward a forest that stretched to the horizon ahead of them. "The last barrier before the Shadowlands proper. Once we cross this, there will be no turning back." The trees of the withered wood had once been magnificent specimens, ancient oaks and towering pines that had grown for centuries before the corruption claimed them. Now they stood like monuments to death, their branches bare and their trunks split by some internal rot. No leaves stirred in the breeze because no leaves remained, and the silence was so complete that their footsteps seemed to echo like thunder. "Stay on the path," Sylviana warned as they entered the dead forest. "The wood remembers what it once was, and that memory can trap unwary travelers in illusions of its former glory." But for all its ominous appearance, the withered wood proved to be the easiest part of their journey so far. The path was clear and direct, leading straight through the heart of the dead forest toward their ultimate destination. They made good time, and by midday they could see their goal rising in the distance. The Shadowlands. Even from miles away, the sight was enough to stop them in their tracks. Where the forest should have continued, there was instead a void, not just an absence of trees, but an absence of everything. The air itself seemed to end at a precise boundary, beyond which lay darkness so complete that it hurt to look at directly. "The original prison," Eliana breathed. "It's magnificent and terrible." "And it's cracking," Thorak observed grimly. Even at this distance, they could see the web of bright lines that ran through the darkness, the ancient bindings, showing the stress fractures that would soon lead to complete failure. "Tomorrow," Kale said quietly, "tomorrow we find out if any of this has been worth the cost." As they made their final camp before entering the Shadowlands, each of them spent time in private preparation. Thorak checked and rechecked his equipment, making last-minute adjustments to weapons and protective gear. Eliana studied her scrolls and maps, memorizing every detail that might prove crucial in the hours ahead. Sylviana stood apart from the group, communing with whatever remained of the natural world in this blighted place. And Kale sat with Ash, simply enjoying the companionship of his oldest friend while they still could. "I wish you could understand," he said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. Tomorrow might be the end of everything, but even if it is, I'm glad you're here with me." Ash looked up at him with those trusting brown eyes and wagged his tail, as if to say that wherever his master went, he would follow. It was a simple loyalty, uncomplicated by doubts or fears about the future. In its own way, it was the most heroic thing Kale had ever witnessed. In the distance, beyond the barrier of absolute darkness, something vast and hungry waited for their arrival. The final confrontation was at hand. The boundary between the withered wood and the Shadowlands was like stepping from one world into another. One moment they were walking on solid ground beneath a gray sky, and the next they were surrounded by a darkness so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. Their magical lights guttered and dimmed, providing barely enough illumination to see each other's faces. "Stay together," Eliana commanded, her voice strange and muffled in the absolute stillness. "In this place, separation means death." They roped themselves together again, just as they had in the Screaming Hills, but here the precaution felt even more vital. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was actively hostile, pressing against their minds and trying to convince them that their companions had already been consumed, that they walked alone through an infinite void. Kale found himself fighting the urge to call out for the others, even though he could feel the rope connecting them and occasionally hear their labored breathing. The Shadowlands seemed designed to attack every sense simultaneously, creating a disorientation so profound that up and down became meaningless concepts. "The prison is directly ahead," Eliana said after consulting one of her instruments, a crystal compass that,